Hello everyone, Miss Carrie here from Miss Carrie's Creations. This week I'm joining the creative design team in a Christmas in July video collab. Today I'm going to share 15 paper flower making techniques with you as I show you how to create a Christmas clothespin wreath. I am going to be using the White Pines paper collection to create my wreath. This is a revamped Bring Back Your Pack collection. You could also use any of our 6x6 patterned papers. This is the holiday stack that was available at the recent Christmas in July sale. You probably recognize some of the patterns in there. Now I do like using the 6x6 patterns for these wreaths because the patterns have been scaled down. So it's much easier to use on the smaller clothespins. You could also use zip strips. You probably have a lot of these in your stash, or you might even have a bunch of paper scraps. So there's a lot of options for you when it comes to the pattern papers you choose for your wreath. After you have chosen your paper patterns, you are going to need to gather a few other supplies. You're going to need some wooden clothespins. These come in a variety of sizes, so pick one that matches your wreath form. You're also going to need something to adhere the paper. Mod Podge works very well. Just make sure you choose the paper adhesive. You can also use this wonderful gel medium by Ranger. It does come in a larger bottle. If you're in a pinch, you can water down the Tumbo Mono liquid glue. That also works very well. My favorite product to use with wood and paper is the Art Basics gel. This comes in a soft matte or a soft gloss. Both work really well for adhering paper onto wood. I have never had any issues with it wrinkling, and it also works as a sealer. You are also going to need a wire wreath frame. I found this in the floral section at my local craft store, but you can also find them on Amazon. I will put a link to the frame as well as all of the other supplies I've shown in the description below. You are also going to find some timestamps for portions of the video in the description below. If you wish to skip ahead to the flower creating tips and tricks, you can go ahead and go to that section of the video. The first thing I need to do is cut my pattern paper into strips. My wooden clothespins measure about 5/8 by 3 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and cut down this pattern paper to 5/8, and then I'm going to cut it down into 3-inch strips. If you do not have a paper trimmer or you want an alternative method for cutting your paper strips, you can use a Cricut craft knife. Simply adhere your clothespins in a row on your paper using that gel medium. Once that adhesive has set and dried, go ahead and take that craft knife and cut along the edge of your clothespins. Now, unfortunately here I did not grab a sharp blade in my Cricut craft knife, so I did have to go across it a couple of times, but this is just another way of cutting down those paper strips. After you have added all of your pattern paper to your clothespins, you can remove the excess paper using a sanding block or a nail file. Now, at this point, you could just set all of your clothespins aside and get ready to assemble your wreath. I do suggest that if you plan on using this wreath over and over again, that you seal your paper. I'm just going to go ahead and use this gel medium to seal the top of each of my clothespins. Now, if you want to add a little bit of a rustic or vintage feel, you can ink all of the edges of your clothespins before you seal them. Make sure you set them aside and allow that ink to dry before you add that gel medium over the top. Now, I am using the soft matte gel on my clothespins. This is going to leave a matte finish once it has all dried and set. I did create a third clothespin here using the soft gloss gel just so that you could see the difference. There isn't a whole lot of shine to it, but you can definitely tell that it does have a little bit more of a glossy feel compared to the matte. And it really just depends on your own personal preference. All right, so I'm going to go off camera and I'm going to finish adding all of the paper to the rest of my clothespins. As I'm finishing up adding all of the pattern paper to the clothespins, I decided that many of you might wonder, how many clothespins am I going to need if I decide to create a wreath? So this is where we're going to have to remember our math skills we learned back in high school. The first thing we need to do is figure out the circumference of the wreath form. So you're going to take the diameter, which is the measurement across. Mine was 12 inches, and you're going to multiply that by pi, which is 3.14. So that gave me 37 inches as a circumference. Now that would mean that I would only need 37 clothespins if they were each an inch wide and I only had one layer around. My clothespins are about a ½ inch wide, so I need to multiply that number by 2, which gives me 75 clothespins. So that would be one layer of clothespins all the way around. I am going to be doing 2 layers of clothespins, so I need to multiply 75 by 2, and that gives me 150 total clothespins that I'm going to need for this project. Now, I know you weren't planning on doing any math today, but some of you might be creating a few of these for gifts this Christmas, or you might be a maker who wants to do a wreath workshop. So I wanted you to be able to figure out how many clothespins you would need for each one of your wreaths. All right, so now that all of my clothespins have been covered with paper and have been distressed using some espresso ink, we're going to go ahead and add these to that wreath wire frame. So when you take a look at this wire frame, you have one side that kind of bubbles up and one side that inverts in. We're going to be using the side that inverts in, but I do want to show you how some makers use the side that bubbles up. You can connect the clothespins to the bottom ring and the top ring, but it is very difficult to layer the clothespins directly behind one another. You're actually going to have to make an every other pattern, and you're going to see a lot of those on Pinterest. So you can see here, it doesn't quite line up as well as I would like. Now, when I go on to the other side, I can easily layer the clothespins right after another. That bottom layer does move around a little bit on the wire, but I am going to show you a solution for that as we create the wreath. So now that you know how the clothespins are going to go onto this wire form, let's talk about how you're going to create your pattern. Depending on how many different patterns you used and how many different colors you used, you could create a variety of different patterns around your wreath. So here I have 3 different designs. One has my blue and brown patterns in front of my red patterns. Now, this design focuses more on the blues and browns with reds as an accent. The second one uses all of the pattern papers in a distinct order, one right behind the other. And then the third one has my red pattern papers in front and my blue and brown pattern papers in the back. I've chosen to use the third pattern where the blues are going to be an accent and the red are going to be my focal point colors. My home decor is red, white, and blue. At Christmas time, I use the same colors in all of my Christmas decorations. Now I'm going to be adding that blue and the brown and the red onto this wreath, but I always like to bring out more red accents in my home decor at Christmas so that you know it's Christmas time. I'm also planning on adding some blue and brown floral elements to this wreath. So having the red as a backdrop behind all of those flowers is really going to help them pop up off the wreath design. When you get to the end and you're trying to put in that final clothespin, you are going to have to do a little bit of squishing to try to get that little clothespin in. They usually fit in just perfectly, but if you have created some sort of pattern around your wreath, you might have to manipulate the pattern just a little bit so that you don't have two colors right next to each other. All right, so now we are putting on those final clothespins, and we are going to finish up this wreath so that we can start creating our floral images. So remember how I told you that the top layer of clothespins does slide around a little bit. If you are going to hang this wreath on the wall, you are also going to notice that they flop forward. So the best thing that you can do is just grab yourself some liquid adhesive and glue all of those clothespins down onto that bottom layer. You could also use a glue gun or glue dots. I plan on hanging this wreath on my front door, and our door faces east. We get a lot of heat on that door, so I need to use something that will not melt in the heat. So I will be using liquid adhesive instead of hot glue. Now that the wreath is complete, I'm going to go ahead and set it aside, and we're going to start working on our floral elements. This is the part of the video that many of you were looking forward to. I'm going to show you a variety of tips and tricks that you can use whenever you're creating paper flowers. I'm going to start out in Cricut Design Space and share two of my favorite wreath making tips with you. Whenever I'm creating a wreath, I always start out with a template. So I go into templates, I create a basic template, and then I change it to a circular shape in the size of the wreath I'm creating. After I've created my template, I need to size my flowers to fit around that wreath shape. One of the best tips I can give you is to hide all of your layers except for the largest layer to help you resize your flowers. So here with the poinsettia, I've hidden all the layers except for the leaf. I'm going to move it over to that wreath shape, and then I'm going to resize that largest layer to fit my wreath design. Since all of the images are still grouped, the hidden layers are sizing proportionately with that leaf layer, even though they are hidden. So you can see when I bring them back, those have resized themselves to match that leaf layer. So this is just a really quick way to size all of your elements around your wreath without having to try to figure out if they're going to fit your design. Just make sure you unhide those layers before you make it so that those images cut out of your material. So now that I have all of my items cut out, I'm not going to show you how to assemble everything, but I am going to give you some more tips and tricks when you are creating your paper flowers. Whenever I create any type of floral arrangement, I always make sure that I ink my floral images. This adds depth to those designs. And most of your flowers have multiple layers, so you want to add as much realistic depth as possible to make them look like a true floral element. On this cutout, I am using some ground espresso distress oxide ink, and I'm adding it around the edges of the craft paper before I layer the two pieces together. When I start to layer my floral elements together, I grab my foam dots. Sometimes I use thin, sometimes I use thick, or a combination of both. The foam dots help to create shadows, and they help to create height between each one of your layers to create a more realistic floral element. As you saw, I did not add foam dots on the back of every one of those Cosmo berries. I actually left some of them flat so that I could have a variety of height and shadow. To add even more dimension to this floral element, I'm going to use some liquid pearls. Adding dimensional items like liquid pearls, dimensional paint, stickles or texture paste, or even beads gives your floral element a more realistic look. You could create a stamen, seeds, shine on a berry, or even a little bud that's starting to pop out. As I bring this up to the camera, you can see that the liquid pearls adds a wonderful dimensional touch to this floral element. When I'm creating floral elements, I also like to add things like snow, moss, rain, dewdrops, or dead leaf edges, or even dying petals. To create the look of snow, I am going to use some speckled egg distress oxide ink on the edges of these pine needles. Now I could also use stickles if I wanted to, but I'm not really a glitter person, so I decided to use the Distress Oxide ink instead. Whenever I'm creating three-dimensional floral elements, I always like to make sure I ink both sides of the cutout. If I'm going to be folding or rolling, or in this instance, curling, I want to make sure that both sides of my flower have that ink. So this holly cut comes from the Flower Market collection, and I don't know if many of you know how it actually goes together. I'm going to use a pair of tweezers, but you could use a quilling tool if you have one. I'm simply going to roll up the base, and then I'm going to glue the edges to seal it closed. Once that glue has dried, I can spread apart those pine needles, which brings me to another tip. Go ahead and fold, bend, and curl all of your floral elements. This adds just another level of dimension to your design. So we spoke about using dimensional paint. You can also add shine and dimension with liquid glass. I cut these baby's breath branches out of copper ore paper and scarlet cardstock so that they looked like holly berries. I want them to have the same shine as a holly berry, so I'm just going to add liquid glass to every one of those little dots. As I bring this up to the camera, you're going to be able to see that the liquid glass gives it a raised glass-like look on each one of those berries, making it a little bit more realistic. Now, if you would like to remove some of the shine instead of adding it, you can add texture with a sanding block or a nail file. This copper ore paper needed a little bit of distressing, so I've gone ahead and rubbed my sanding file across it, and you can see that it just adds a beautiful texture to that copper ore paper. I'm hoping that the camera picks up the texture because in person it looks exactly like an old weathered branch. Now the last thing we're going to do is assemble the poinsettia. I know a lot of you have not created this Flower Market poinsettia, so I wanted to give you a few tips and tricks. I have already added some of the ground espresso Distress Oxide ink around the edges of these two leaf layer cuts. Now I'm going to be adding some veins to create the look of leaves. I'm just going to fold each one of those leaves and then add a little bit of ink along that fold line. This creates the look of natural veins. Now you could also do this with a matching green avocado ink if you wanted to. Since my wreath has more of a distressed look, I decided to use that espresso color. I've gone ahead and added the veins to the second layer as well. I've used both the dark and the light side of the avocado cardstock. I love that Close to My Heart cardstock has a light and a dark color. Now I'm just going to layer the two pieces together using some thick 3D foam tape. The poinsettia petals have been cut out of the white pines pattern paper. I'm going to go ahead and also ink the edges using that ground espresso ink. I've also cut some additional layers out of vellum. This is something I love to do with my flowers. On these layers, I did spray some shimmer mist in a roll top desk color. This adds a little bit of staining and shimmer to each one of those vellum layers. Now the shimmer does cause the petals to curl up a little bit, but I love the way it does that because I always take advantage of that curl when I create a flower. I'm also going to be adding veins on each one of the petal layers. Did you know on poinsettias, these are actually considered false flowers? The actual flowers of a poinsettia are those tiny little flowers in the center. So I am going to mimic a poinsettia by adding veins onto each one of these petal layers. If you're having difficulty folding your petals right down the center, you can use a ruler and a stylus. I've just grabbed a foam pad here. I'm going to place a straight edge ruler right in the center of each one of those leaves, and then I'm just going to use my stylus to draw a straight line. Now I can fold right on that center line, add a little bit of ink, and I have another vein. When you start to layer a flower that has a lot of layers, you're going to want to make sure that you rotate each petal layer slightly. Unless it is a flower design where the petals are supposed to line up perfectly, you do want to create a little bit of an off-center petal layer to create a more realistic looking flower. When I'm creating home decor pieces, I want a nice full flower for my design. So I always alternate thin and thick foam tape in between each one of the layers. This creates the look of a realistic flower that's in full bloom. My last tip for you is to think outside the box. In the center of this flower, I am going to add a button. Not only does it look simply adorable, but it also matches the theme of all of the other elements I have on my wreath. Now, I'm sure you were probably wondering about that white poinsettia you saw in other parts of the video. Let me show you a few fun elements that I added to this. I did use pearl paper to create a beautiful shine. On the vellum layers, I ended up using stickles to create the veins as well as a fold. On some of the vellum layers, I ended up using a speckled egg distress oxide ink to create a pale blue vellum layer. And then I also ended up using liquid glass with beads in the center. Now this is a gorgeous poinsettia, but it really doesn't match all of the other elements that I added onto my wreath. I almost left it completely out of the video, but I wanted to show you some other options that you could add to the poinsettias you're creating for your wreath. All right, so now the last step is to put all of this together. So I'm just going to use a variety of foam tape and glue dots to add each one of these elements onto the wreath. You can see I've kind of auditioned some of the elements at the top to help me with placement. Now, I choose to use glue dots when I'm adding the elements to the wreath because they are a little bit more forgiving than liquid adhesive. Now, I know I told you that I was planning on hanging this out on my front door where it was going to be in the sun. Since I'm using glue dots, I'm going to have to find another place for my wreath. If I decide to hang it on a door that faces the sun, I am going to have to come back and use liquid adhesive to place all of these items down. As I'm adding these items to the wreath, I am bending and shaping them to give them a more realistic look. I did decide to keep it pretty simple. If you saw my original Cricut design, there were a lot more elements that I cut out, but once I started adding them to the wreath, I decided that less was more. So I know I told you that my home is decorated in red, white, and blue, and at Christmas time, I have a lot of that navy blue with a combination of reds and a lot of craft colors. I would love to know if you are a traditional Christmas color person, reds and greens, or if you prefer a lot of metallics, golds, and silvers, or if you like a lot of the country colors, reds, whites, blue, craft, or if you have a completely different color scheme at Christmas time. So, can you believe it? The wreath is complete. Not only did you learn how to put together this clothespin wreath, you also learned a ton of tips and tricks for creating your own paper flowers. Now, if you wanted to, you could add a little bow to the lower right side. You could also add a sentiment across the middle. For me, simplicity is how I celebrate Christmas, so this wreath is going to fit perfectly in my home. I want to thank you for joining me today as we created this Christmas project. I hope that you were inspired to try something new the next time you create a paper flower. All week long, the creative design team has been creating some amazing Christmas in July projects. Jema will be the next person on our team to share an amazing project with you. I'll add her video link tomorrow. If you've missed any of the past creative design team projects, I've added some playlists for you to enjoy. While you're at it, go ahead and click that subscribe button so that you don't miss out on any future video tutorials. I hope you have a wonderful week. I can't wait to see what you create.